The first question, what is eBPF exactly, and what are you most excited about eBPF? Who wants to take that first?
I guess me. So what is eBPF exactly? So eBPF is a way to dynamically and programmatically extend the Linux kernel in many different areas of the kernel. The areas that I'm most interested in is the networking areas. And what I'm most excited about eBPF is, at least, like I said, I'm focused on application networking, service mesh use cases, and I'm really interested in how we can use eBPF to offload some of the things that we do in the service mesh proxy into the kernel, and then also augment and complement the type of observability and telemetry that we can get from the mesh with what we can see in the kernel. So yeah, that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, that's great. Lawrence, you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, so I think Christian did a good job of explaining what it is. So as far as what I'm most excited about, I also am very interested in the networking aspect of it. I think that it will really be able to, so earlier today I had a session that kind of talked about eBPF with ambient mesh. I think that in general, with service mesh in general, eBPF has such an important part at the networking layer that it will become pretty much the de facto standard for doing kind of network redirection, network acceleration for anything that's related to service mesh. And then as you look forward, you can see that some of the capabilities that are in the proxy right now, so like in ambient with the Z-tunnel or even in sidecars, that we'll be able to push those further into the kernel with eBPF. So hopefully, one day we won't even have to have a proxy at all.
That's great. John, I would love to hear your perspective too.
Yeah, for me, I'm just most excited that, in one of the previous talks, someone mentioned that we take a small amount of Istio config and then generate a ton of Envoy config, for example. And we do the same thing with other layers of APIs. What eBPF allows us to do is instead of trying to express all of this config as this declarative config model, we can just write it in code, right? And so we can take that small amount of input config and then just write the code as eBPF logic to actually do it directly, instead of trying to take these APIs that are kind of generic and declarative and try and model our very bespoke, specific use cases for them, right? So what you may express in 10,000 lines of Envoy config could maybe be 5 lines of code, right? So it allows a much more direct model to represent some of the complex behaviors we're looking for.
Awesome. Eitan, do you want to add anything?
Sure. Just to mirror, I think for me, performance, observability, security, right? So the ability to augment the features, the amazing things that Service Mesh already offers, and potentially speed up the mesh by pushing them down, as Lauren said, pushing down these features into the kernel and really taking advantage of that functionality.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question is, honestly, I thought about this at KubeCon in Valencia in Europe. There was a lot of confusion around eBPF and sidecar lists. Can you help our users clarify if they are the same or if they are different? Can we dismiss sidecars now with eBPF? Anyone? John, you want to go there first?
To me, they're related only because there's some products that happen to use them both together. But otherwise, they're fairly orthogonal, right? You can have a sidecar list service mesh that doesn't use eBPF, and you could use eBPF to do things other than service mesh, right? So for example, in the Istio ambient mesh, there's no sidecars, but it doesn't necessarily need eBPF to achieve that functionality.
Just to add on to what John said, I think that Lawrence mentioned that in the long term, ways that we can use eBPF to potentially replace these node-level proxies like the Z-tunnel. But I think to focus that in the not long term, but sort of medium term, but then in the short term, focus on the ways that we can augment the service mesh with eBPF technologies, whether that be with a sidecar or a sidecar list. So just envisioning the sidecar model of Istio, but potentially getting L7 telemetry with eBPF, right? So if the only thing you're interested in is telemetry, right, maybe you don't need to do any L7 processing. So essentially taking individual use cases and putting them in the kernel, and so not, as John said, not necessarily needing to combine the two concepts, but using them for what they are good at.
I think another aspect that tends to come up and contribute to the confusion that I think could be more clearly stated as, where does the proxy actually run? I think that's a more interesting question, because eBPF, can eBPF replace all the layer 7, all the stuff the sidecar does? No. eBPF can be used for some portions of that. But so the question shouldn't be about, will eBPF replace sidecars? It's about, where does the proxy run? And that's a problem that we tackled head on when we worked on Ambient. So the proxy doesn't have to run as a sidecar, but like John said, these are orthogonal, concerns. eBPF is not, a replacement for the sidecar.
Yeah, you want?
Yeah. Just the one thing I would add is that even eventually, if we are able to get rid of the proxy by pushing all of the concerns to the kernel with eBPF, I think that's still a ways off, but I do think that just because we can, doesn't mean we should. Because there's a lot of, so having spent, a bit of time working on it, it's very challenging to implement certain things in eBPF. And so if we try to push everything into it, even if we can technically achieve it, it may not be usable, and it may not be something that, that someone's going to run in production, at least not yet. So I think that there's definitely potential for it. I just think that it will take a little bit of time to get there if we decide to do that.
Yeah, we're not talking about a little bit of time, at least many years, more than a few years, right? Because even when the feature landed in the kernel, it took a few years to get to a particular Linux distro, yeah. Thank you so much for that question and answer. So the next question is, what role do you think eBPF can play in service mesh? Do you guys want to add anything? I feel like some of you already touched on that topic already. If not, we can skip to the next question.
I think what they said about potential is really true. Like, to me, eBPF today can be really useful for certain things that are very restricted use cases. Like, if you only care about getting telemetry for your information, sure, do everything in eBPF. You don't have to copy everything up to user space. It's very fast. You get what you want. But the minute you want to add something like TLS or something on top of that, which for most users is kind of table stakes for service mesh, now you already have to copy everything to user space. Anyways, you might as well have just done the telemetry in the user space as well, right? So as the functionality expands more and more and can cover more use cases, it starts to make more sense. Today, I think it's mostly niche cases and small optimizations, right? I think someone may have talked about kind of optimizing some like the redirection logic with eBPF, for example. Like, that's great. We should absolutely do that. But we're talking, 5, 10% performance gains, which is not matching the entire hype of eBPF, right? So a lot of it is potential, with some of that being realized now and some of that in potentially distant future, I think.
I have one more. I think there's an interesting, so we've been talking a lot about ambient, and there's a lot of interesting questions about, something that was brought up, some questions that have been brought up to me about even going back to previous KubeCons about the security, the encryption and data over the wire just within the node itself, which is another, as I mentioned, I view eBPF as a potential security gain. And so potentially leveraging eBPF on the node itself to make sure that the traffic is always encrypted.
I'll add one more thing, which is kind of on top of what John was saying with the network redirection. I think the performance benefits, they're not mind-blowing, but they are there. I think more importantly, at least in my opinion, is the fact that it makes the current setup for the network configuration much easier to digest. And as an end user, that might not be the biggest thing because it's more of an implementation detail, but just from what was needed to get the current setup working, eBPF can kind of simplify that in a lot of ways because we talked about it before. You really are expressing it in basically code. Like you're saying with logic, this is what I want to do with the network, versus trying to piece together all of these different pieces of the network stack using various tools to do so. So I think that there's a benefit there as far as like maintainability goes, on top of some performance gains as well.
That's great. All right. Yeah. I guess I'd like to open up for questions, actually. It would be cool because, our question could long for a while. So if you guys have questions, I would encourage you to walk up here because we only have a couple of microphones. So yeah. Oh, just shout it out if you feel you are loud.
So like on the skill is on the CNC, right? So how many users you can expect to reach?
Did you hear the second part?
Yeah,
The question was how many releases of Istio per year? I think with the CNCF adoption, there's no currently planned changes for the release cycle, so there'll continue to be 4 releases per year.
Yeah, but we are getting a lot of benefits certainly from CNCF. I've seen our Slack user increase dramatically too. I've also seen different vendors participate in the Istio, particularly in ambient, which I haven't seen in before the Istio CNCF donation. So that was very positive for the project. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
it might sound crazy, but is it possible to parse HTTP or eBPF?
Yeah, the question was, is it possible to parse HTTP in eBPF?
Go ahead.
So the answer is yes. There are a couple of ways of doing that. It's kind of gets more tricky when you're talking about like HTTP1 versus HTTP2, but in both cases, technically it's possible. There are also techniques like you can use user probes, so you're technically using eBPF, but you're hooking into user space code. That's how some of the libraries do things like this is like I want to use eBPF to see traffic that is being TLS encrypted, right? And you can do that in user space, but use eBPF to do so. But even just at the more generic level, HTTP1 ultimately is just some text on top of a TCP connection. And so when it's just HTTP1, it's relatively straightforward. It gets more tricky with HTTP2, but it's still doable. And yeah, I think that's a lot.
And yeah, I was going to say in Glue Mesh, that is exactly what we're doing. Because of the workloads that run, for example, for ambient, the workloads that run that have the Z tunnel deployed with them, they're missing out on some of the layer 7 telemetry. And being able to capture that using eBPF or some mechanism so that you don't have to rely on sidecars is a really important win. The second thing I'll say is that I think it's eBPF day tomorrow.
Today.
Oh, it was today. All right. Well, go catch. Was it? Hopefully, it was recorded. One of our engineers, Eitan, right?
Yeah.
Presented exactly on that topic. So, but short answer is yes, you can do it.
All right, great questions. Go ahead, that gentleman. Yeah.
So eBPF, there was an eBPF conference, I think last month. Sicilian folks hosted or whatever online. And Dave Thaler did a whole talk on signing eBPF programs to facilitate adoption. Is that a significant roadblock to getting eBPF in test and production systems?
Yes.
Or people deploying now without that signing ability?
So it's a very interesting. Okay, so the question, in essence, I'm sorry if I don't repeat the whole thing, but basically, right now, so Dave Taylor brought up the signing of eBPF programs, right? So in this talk, Jason just mentioned in the previous talk about signing containers and about that being a pretty standard open source security standard. And so essentially, how do we do the same thing for a program running in the kernel? And it's a great question, and it's not the first time I've heard that question. And I think, in fact, it's actually something that, I don't know if anyone here has heard of or played with Bumblebee, which is a tool that we created, and actually that is and has a way to sign eBPF probes. So
Package and sign.
Package and sign eBPF probes. So that is certainly one way to go about it, right? It just uses the entire existing infrastructure, right, that has been built around packaging and signing OCI distributed bundles. OCI standing for Open Container Initiative, and so I think that it's a very interesting problem. You're right, and no vendors right now are running their BPF programs with that. So from a security perspective, right, how do you verify? And I think that Bumblebee is definitely one way of doing that, and it would be I'm definitely interested to see going forward how more people and more vendors just go into that, because it's going to be as more and more people run more and more eBPF, and as potentially customers allow their internal, right, as users allow their internal users to run various eBPF programs, like how do you know, right? If this is coming from the internet, how do you know what this is, right? How do you verify it's running? It's root in the kernel. Like, are you kidding me? So it's a very interesting question. I don't have a perfect answer.
Yeah, honestly, that question I believe come up in eBPF Day in Europe, Valencia, and the Eitan actually just implemented right at that week and support that for Bumblebee. That's how a team rolls sometimes. Most of the time, I should say. I think that gentleman with the black mask had a question. Go ahead. Kind of.
Does eBPF work nicely in concert with Cilium? And is there a sort of overlap between the two of them?
Okay, I think the question is, what's the overlap between eBPF and Cilium?
And do they work well together?
Do they work closely together? Yeah. Or work well?
So it's interesting, it's an interesting question because Cilium's data plane or data path is primarily implemented in eBPF. And so eBPF is kind of like a much broader technology, right? And it's an implementation detail of Cilium. And that's kind of what allows them to have, those performance gains and everything by using Cilium because it's implemented in eBPF. As far as the overlap goes, you can definitely write, networking modules in eBPF and load those alongside Cilium. The hard part about that is you just need to not, depending on what you're trying to do, you don't want to step on Cilium's toes or vice versa, right? And so it kind of depends on what you're trying to do, but you definitely can have multiple components or multiple, projects running that use eBPF at the same time, for sure.
Anyone else wants to add anything? Good. All right. Any other questions?
I don't have a question. I have something to say.
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah. So can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the work that we did with Ambient, people was really excited about 3 things that we gained. One of them is performance. The other one is everything that related with the operational. Yeah, operational. Oops. So basically, the thing that people were very excited about as gaming is, first of all, we get rid of the proxy, right? So it's costless. Number 2, we did a lot of gaming in terms of, we're hoping to do a lot of gaming in terms of the performance. And the last but not least is the operational. So I wanted to say something that we learned in Sol. And it's something that I don't know that we heard before, that we talked about it enough before. So I wanted to highlight that, what we learned from our customers. Here's what we see. eBPF can give you some performance, but honestly, it's really, really, really tiny bit related to what you really care of. So here's what we see from our customer. There is a budget of those latency. And as long as you are kind of in that budget, you know what else customer wants? Feature. That's what they really care. They don't really care to get the micro unless it's a very specific system. What they really want is there are several features and other stuff. So I just wanted to mention that, and we are, very bullish about eBPF, and I think that we can get a lot of stuff in terms of the operational, and I think that it's very important for us to get a lot of observability, which could be really, really interesting. I just want you to know that I personally don't think that it's ever going to replace the server proxy, and I don't think it should. That's at least my opinion. I just wanted to tell you, based on what is the monkey.
Yeah, any panelists disagree or agree with that?
She's my boss. I agree.
Well, John, I think you agree too?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of hype around eBPF that's not very true, I think. There's a lot of value, but it's not going to fully replace Envoy. It's a full L7 proxy anytime in our lifetime, probably.
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason I'm personally really excited about Ambient, because I think Ambient really brings a lot of clarity on eBPF and sidecar, and how these should interact and without sidecar. Any questions from the audience? Oh, go ahead.
One question there. Is there any way we can capture the request coming to any of the applications which has an Amazon company? We can capture the request and recreate another environment.
Yes. Yes, a long time ago, we created an open source project called Loop.
Yeah.
And basically, it's doing exactly this. How do you call it?
Yeah, Envoy has something called a tap filter where you can record requests going into it. It's not exposed directly, but we did. We had a
Yeah, but it's from open source, so the idea was very simple. It said that you have some production project, right?
Yes.
How do you know what's going
We
on?
are facing the
So,
same issue.
exactly.
But we are trying to write some class on Twitter to get it. The problem with class on Twitter is for example, we have a huge class on 100 MB or 100 MB of file class on file, Twitter file, right? When we want to put in the site, sometimes the filter, the Kubernetes config map will support some amount of limited settings. If your config is more than much, it doesn't support it. I think we tried to use the WebAssembly backend, but the plugin was not working at that time. I'm not sure what happened. This we tried around 1 year back.
Did you open source it? We did.
loop.
No, we didn't open source Loop.
No, we didn't open source Loop, but I think we contributed back some of the stuff we did into Envoy.
But I mean, we honestly this is something.
Yeah, that's
That's real work.
Is that different from traffic mirroring?
It is. So the idea with Loop was a little bit different. So I'll explain you what it is. We had a project called Squat. And Squat basically, I don't know if you ever heard about it.
Yes, on that.
Right.
But I don't know if that, let's say, open source product.
It was an open source project and we not really working on this, but in the actual what was it about is basically was debugger for microservices. So it was very nice to basically always let the debugger based on which language the microservice is running. You can actually step to one microservice, jump to the other one to determine the debugger which is doing. That was really cool. The only problem with that is you can't do it in production environment. So the idea was how can we actually take that powerful tools, but actually run it outside the production environment by actually debugging the production environment. And that's when Loop is coming into place. The idea was, what if we can record every transaction, right? So let's say that the transaction is starting. Everything going in and out of the sidecar is actually going through these things, right? So we can get everything, right? And then so we're doing all of the transaction. In the end, if everything is good, we know it's the only one, because we're happy, we just reach it. We don't care about it. But one of those is actually under 500, basically capturing all of it, speeding up the environment, attaching the debugger, and basically rerun the environment with all the data, right? Which is pretty, but yeah, there's a lot. So we don't, but we'll do that.
All right, can you guys hear that well in the back? Hopefully. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, if not, I'm going to ask one more question. Let's see. Oops, sorry. I guess my question is, what do you see eBPF and Service Mesh in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, for me, I see it being less noticeable, right? You don't see people talking about at KubeCon about deploying Kubernetes for the first time anymore, right? That's just what everyone here has already done. A few years ago, you saw that about Istio, and everything was about like, we just deployed Istio, like how do you deploy Istio, all that type of things. So we're starting to get to where Istio is more prevalent, but it's still very, very visible when you're using it, right? That's kind of where the name for ambient mesh came from. We want to make it kind of ambient in the cluster, right? It's just there. You just have a Kubernetes cluster and you have MTLS, right? And then you add the functionality on top of it, right? If I want to do traffic splitting and send 5% of traffic to my new version, I should just be able to use an API, declare that I want that, and go about my day. I shouldn't have to worry about deploying sidecars or a control plane or all these other things. So I think that that's where we're headed, is that it's really just API driven. You shouldn't have to think much about installing, operating, managing. Part of that's by simplifying the architecture. Part of that's by product offerings that kind of automate things away. But we're definitely moving in that direction.
Yeah, I fully agree with what John said. Basically, that stuff's going to become boring, but it's going to enable opportunities on top of it. For example, like something you were just asking about, the debuggability, right? Various ways to plug in new policy engines, and so. But that's going to lay the groundwork for more of the innovations, more of the problems that we're going to need to solve on top of it.
So I think that I agree with both of those statements. I think the only thing that I would add is that, if you're in an organization that decided to use Kubernetes, more than likely you have the problems that service mesh solves. And so I think that, kind of just reiterating what they were saying, I think the service mesh is going to become a standard part of your Kubernetes cluster going forward. And with things like ambient, it's going to just be there, and you will not hopefully have to interact with it pretty much at all and get all of the features that you need for deploying microservices in Kubernetes. So basically, it's saying what they just said. But yeah, I agree.
In an effort not to repeat, I will end there.
I think our panelists are very agreeable today. All right, any other question from the audience? We would love to hear from you. Don't be shy. All right, so let's get to that question. What's the most craziest thing you have heard about users running Istio? Actually, one of you in the audience might be able to help us answer too, but I'll start with our panelists.
Let's start with Eitan. He's been talking about this all day. Let's just hear it finally.
All right, so I don't know about y'all, but my least favorite type of bug is a bug that only shows up in prod and only after a month. And so there was someone running Istio in prod for a month, and after a month, all of the DNS requests would start failing from the sidecar. This was an Istio.
When we released Istio, the 4 DNS spots were like, we did not scale up the 4 DNS spot, but we only did in the lower requirements, we tested with only like 2 less spots. But when in production, we deployed Istio and we did not even increase the 4 DNS, and all our DNS was.
Yep. Yeah. See. Yeah. So plenty of DNS issues all around. So this one turned out that after about a month, there was a bug in Envoy that would essentially all of the UDP DNS traffic would just fail for no good reason. Right? Wireshark didn't show anything. Like there was so much kernel debugging, and then eventually it just turned out that there was a bug in the UDP code in Envoy, and if you switched it to TCP, just worked. So that one was. Whew.
How long it took you to troubleshooting that?
That took like all of our best engineers and a whole bunch of field engineers a couple of weeks.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
That is crazy. Yeah. Anyone else wants to share anything? John, anything on your side, or everything worked?
I think one of the work that we've done
with Ambient, not me, Yuval. But when Yuval tried to do Ambient working redirect, I think that while he was building this redirection, Yuval is not here, he's our chief architect, he basically found 2 or 3 kernel bugs, right?
Yeah.
And basically you need to try to overcome because you're not going to fix the kernel. And basically you needed to do some gaming in order to overcome the bugs in the kernels.
That's why eBPF will help with that.
Exactly.
All right, any other questions? All right, if not, oh, there's a question. Okay, sorry, how could I miss you? Go ahead.
So if a person's new to Istio, should they like just try to like do regular Istio first, or should they do the ambient mesh, or how would one start out?
Yeah, Christian, go ahead.
Buy my book. No. You should start with regular Istio with Sidecar. Maybe start with the Istio Ingress Gateway and just get familiar with the resources, get familiar with one Envoy proxy, and then start to, there's other like educational things, workshops, and the documentation from the Istio.io website. That'll really help tremendously. But that's probably what I would suggest.
Yeah, I would say the same, but just to at least clarify why I think that is not that, in a year or two from now, I'd probably give a different answer and say, just go deploy the Z-tunnel everywhere, get MTLS, and then add on your proxies. It's more that Ambient is not yet mature, right? It's very experimental right now. So, you should start with the thing that's production ready, and then once Ambient's mature, then think about that moving forward.
Yeah, great question. Claim your book for sure too. Any other questions? All right. Oh, there's one more question.
Franks will kind of have the Istio out of the box.
Yes.
Basically, yes, in some form, I think. Maybe not Istio. There's some cloud providers have other service meshes they're invested in. But I certainly think that it will start to be more and more embedded in the platform. We're already seeing that in many cases. Ambient, I think, helps with that a lot because it makes it a lot easier to have kind of the baseline mesh without the traffic modification, right? With sidecars and the full L7 processing, you get, for example, HTTP load balancing. That's great, but that actually changes the behavior of the application. So maybe users don't want that, and it breaks their application. With Ambient, we have kind of a split where there's the safe subset that everyone can kind of get value out of, and then they can kind of opt into a more full mesh experience. So I think that will make that much more commonplace.
I think it is, but I will say that notice the fact that basically we just talked about Kubernetes. I don't know any customer that is on. Oh, I did, but those the new morning cloud, right? Most of the people that we know have a lot of VMs out there, right? The question is how that tied together and where is it going to lie, right? So I think that the cloud provider probably some, like I know, for instance, that back on the day before Outreach was end of life, I know that they tried to bring ECS and serverless together, then they died. Maybe they should have done. But all I'm saying is that think about different workloads because that's how we see it on our application. It's not only Kubernetes, it's never that.
And even if it is Kubernetes, what you, in some cases, what you'll see is the platform provider will provide a distro, bake it in. But then, for whatever reason, maybe they forked it, maybe they patched it, maybe they did something, but their ability to keep up with what the rest of the community is doing falls way behind. And so you get stale versions of, that may not support expanding to VMs and some of these other platforms as nicely as maybe more recent versions. But yeah, it kind of makes sense. Well, I think overall what we see, what Adib was kind of alluding to, is that we see organizations that will take Kubernetes, they already have VMs, they might be on premises, they might be in public cloud, and they will build, they're effectively building their enterprise developer platforms for their teams. Service Mesh is part of that. Now how that gets delivered, might be, you deploy it in the various platforms. You might self-manage it. We've built a lot of stuff around simplifying that kind of stuff, owning the life cycle of Istio, that kind of thing. But ultimately, the enterprises are trying to improve their developer productivity. So in their platform, they will have some of these capabilities that ideally will span clusters, workloads, clouds, and that kind of environment.
Yeah, awesome. Anyone? Okay, one more question, maybe the last question.
Maybe you guys already covered, but maybe I missed. Could ambient mesh cover multi-cluster communication?
Okay, the question is, does ambient service mesh cover multi-cluster communication? Christian?
Not at the moment, but that is on the roadmap for sure, and that's really important to the community, certainly to us at Solo. Yep.
All right, with that, I would like to thank all the panelists, and also most importantly, thank you everyone for staying with us. There's music, there's water, everything out there, so nice. So thank you so much for staying with us. If you have further questions about Istio, eBPF, Service Mesh, the Solo team is going to be available at Service Mesh Con. I believe John is going to also be there too. And on Wednesday, we'll be at the booth. If you want the books, we will be handing out the books at our booth. We're going to have a signing session on Wednesday at the booth crawl. I believe it's 6 to 8 p.m. Also, on Wednesday night, we're inviting everybody to drinks, I think right in this venue from 8 to 11. So free drinks on my boss. Yeah, so thank you everyone for attending and joining us. Really, really appreciate your attendance.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.